My honourable friend, the Minister for Housing, announced on the 27th of March additional allocations of £88 million to London boroughs in 1990-91 to relieve homelessness.
Will the Prime Minister accept that 10 years ago, in 1979, there were 2,750 households in temporary accommodation in London? The current figure is over 25,000, and a further 2,000 people are sleeping on the streets. And that when her government asked the local authorities what resources they required to deal with the homeless problem in London, they asked for at least £480 million. They were given less than 1/6 of what they wanted. Does she not agree that people sleeping on the streets of our capital city, being charged exorbitant rents, and children being brought up in bed and breakfast hotels is a disgrace to a civilised country?
Corbyn joined the party before he came of age. The young Jeremy was often tasked with collecting members' subs on his bike. But it was at home where his politics were shaped.
There was an atmosphere both in my house and indeed in Jeremy's house of the parents and the youngsters talking together quite seriously about politics and being taken seriously, not being patronised.
In an early example of activism, he'd refused to join the school's combined cadet force. Conscientious objectors like Corbyn were instead allowed to mow the lawns and foment rebellion. By the time Corbyn moved to London in the 1970s, they had a theory. To fix Labour, its members needed to take over the party.
And the Home Secretary had to reply to attacks on the police, like this one by a militant young delegate.
If this government can find time and money, apparently, to appease the police, how is it they have not found the time to do anything to bring about democratic control of the police? We are a socialist party and there are social solutions to the problems, and the solution is socialism at the end of the day.
The government began closing state-owned coal pits that weren't making any profits, and Mrs Thatcher appointed Norman Tebbit as Employment Secretary. He immediately went about creating legislation to limit the legal protection the unions had. One such measure forced them to ballot workers before calling a strike. But of course, closing mines meant thousands would lose their jobs.
There are 1 million people now who are long-term unemployed, that's to say over a year, and something must be done. We are building up a society so unstable and so unfair that it's simply not acceptable.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
I say stand down, Margaret, stand down, please stand down, Margaret.
I feel you brought me here under false pretences.
No, I'd like to...
Well, let me make my point. I've just come back from Derbyshire. I've been there every weekend. I've been round on the soup round with the women last week, and I've seen what's happened. The police are arresting people. When they get them in the cells, they're asking them who they voted for. Did they vote for Arthur Scargill? What newspaper do they read? They're arresting people who are trying even to picket peacefully. And I think the ITN coverage of the dispute has been a disgrace, because here are people defending their jobs. They're trying desperately to see that their communities are not killed.
Oh, I don't think that's the case.
Why don't you cover the crisis in the mining industry upon which you and I will depend for energy when the oil runs out? As I tell you candidly, why support the miners? They do very dangerous and difficult work. Our future depends upon them. Whole communities will die if they are allowed to be treated this way. The police are going well beyond the law.
We just report what we find.
I doubt that. I don't think that's what you're doing at all, truthfully, but that's your business.
Mr. Tony Benn.
But I think what you've also got to recognise, and I'm sure you do, that the systematic erosion
of the authority of trade unions since 1979 has been as a deliberate act as policy as creating mass unemployment, because they know that by creating mass unemployment, harnessing and shackling trade unions, fining trade union leaders and taking the funds away, they've got carte blanche for the multinationals of the likes of Rupert Murdoch to come in and destroy industries and destroy jobs.
It was class war.
So the unions were defeated, but thousands lost their jobs. Margaret Thatcher had won.
She had beaten what she called the enemy within.
Whether you win or lose a battle, in the long run doesn't matter. The question is, did you fight it hard? And we look back on so many occasions in the past where working people have been defeated. Can you draw inspiration from the courage of people who fought the battle that was their job to fight? Whether you win or lose isn't the final determinant of whether it was worth fighting. You have to fight or you lose.
Thatcher was just as merciless with her enemies abroad.
The Falklands War. On the 2nd of April 1982, forces from Argentina invaded the British overseas territory of the Falklands Islands, the first invasion of British territory since World War II. The small British garrison of 80 Royal Marines there surrendered. Argentina claimed sovereignty over the islands, and its military believed that Britain would not try to regain the islands by force. The Argentinians were within only 480 kilometers, or 300 miles of the islands. Britain, meanwhile, was 12,000 kilometers, or 7,440 miles away. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, accused of neglecting the islands, assembled a task force to recover them. It would consist of 6,000 troops and 30 warships, plus auxiliary vessels. The British forces were highly trained professionals and well led. 255 British were killed and 775 were wounded in the Falklands War. The Argentinian forces, meanwhile, were mainly ill-trained, poorly motivated conscripts. However, they had air superiority. Around 11,400 Argentinian prisoners were captured during the war. 649 were killed and 1,657 wounded.
It was one of those strange moments when you're arrested by the police and you say, under what charge am I arrested? Assuming one is going to be told you're doing obstruction or something rather. They said no, it was under the Diplomatic Immunities Act. It was behaviour that was offensive to a foreign diplomatic mission. And the police officer said to me, what do you plead? Why have you come here? I said, I've come here to be as offensive as possible to the South African apartheid regime, but I offer no plea, so that you will have to offer a plea on my part of not guilty. The cases all went to court, and we were all exonerated on the grounds of our moral outrage of apartheid, all given compensation, and all that compensation was given to the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement.
Tony Benn said to me, this is a great idea to put up a plaque in memory of Emily Wilding Davidson. And I said, yeah, good idea. Nobody's ever going to agree to that. And he said, no, they won't. And then a few days later he said, let's do it. And then he asked me to help him. And so I met him when the house finished one evening, went to his car, picked up the toolbox, the plaque and some tools and an electric drill, walked through Parliament late at night, 11 o'clock. Policeman comes up to us and I thought, oh my goodness, how do I explain to a policeman what I'm doing walking through Parliament carrying an electric drill at 11 o'clock at night? He said, we're just on our way to the chapel. He said, good idea. So he then started walking with us, and Tony said, no, it's okay, there's no need to come with us, we'll be fine, we'll know the way there. So I've got to let you in, because he had the key. So he walked with us and offered to carry the toolbox, but didn't ask why we were carrying a toolbox into the chapel. I mean, it must have looked a bit odd, to be honest. So we went into the chapel, he locked the door, I opened the door and locked it behind us. Went down there, and Tony supervised it while I drilled the holes and put all the stuff there, and the picture of Emily Wilding Davidson. And then we went home. Then the next day, Tony got up in Parliament on a point of order and said he'd put this thing up and so on. And they were really annoyed, you can't do that, defacing Parliament, blah, 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 blah. Because you'd never get permission those days for something like this. But it was there. And then there was various complaints, but nothing happened with them, and the cleaners cleaned it. every day, polished it, made it nice. And it's now a tourist attraction in the building. Well, it's important that Emily Wilding Davidson should be remembered.
And Jeremy Corbyn MP, who backed and helped organise Mr Benn's campaign. I want to ask Mr Corbyn a question first of all. So you think you've made the Labour Party a bit more virile and a bit more socialist?
There's been hundreds, if not thousands, of discussions at constituency and trade union level which has encouraged that debate, and I believe will result in stronger socialist policies in the long run in this party.
Reacting to Tony Benn's failed bid to become deputy leader back in 1981, Corbyn blamed some left-leaning Labour MPs who abstained in the vote for Benn's loss.
But above all, I think we should also be considering the actions and attitudes of a number of left Labour MPs in Parliament.
The man insisting on higher sartorial standards from his fellow members is Tory MP Terry Dix. He says that Labour scruffs like Robin Corbyn should be barred from addressing the House unless they pull their socks up.
It's not a fashion parade, it's not a gentleman's club, it's not a bankers' institute, it's a place where the people are represented.
Is that the jumper that your mum made?
Yes, it is.
She didn't make the shirt as well, I suppose?
No, she didn't make the shirt, that came from the co-op. Late at night here, it's quite disgusting. After the dinners are over and the division bell rings for 10 o'clock, there's fleets of limousines draw up and out get large Tory MPs with even larger stomachs wearing dinner jackets, and they stride in to vote.
Corbyn's commitment to LGBT plus rights stretched back to when it was a deeply unpopular cause. As a councillor in Haringey before becoming an MP, he led the defence of a gay community centre attacked by the National Front. In Parliament from 1983, he voted for virtually every piece of equalities legislation going. He was the only Labour MP to defy the whip to support a Liberal Democrat amendment to the Human Rights Bill in 1998 to outlaw discrimination based on sexuality.
Jeremy Corbyn, Labour candidate for Islington North. Defeat of the Tory government will be brought about by a series of disputes of which Parliament is only a part.
The quote the Tories picked out was very important. Corbyn does see Westminster as only one front in a much bigger fight against conservatism. Even in the febrile 1980s, Corbyn and his allies were well to the left. They believed in stronger trade unions, significant redistribution, and that power was won not just in Westminster, but on the streets. Their associations too offended Middle England. Corbyn embraced Martin McGuinness when he was still a pariah, and he campaigned for those convicted wrongly of pub bombings.
These are the faces of the men convicted of Britain's worst ever terrorist attack, the Birmingham pub bombings in 1974, in which 21 people died. These are the faces of the same men after 16 years of wrongful imprisonment.
At the height of the terrorist atrocities in Northern Ireland, he caused outrage by inviting Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams to the House of Commons.
Why are you giving a man who has shown such contempt for British society this privilege?
He's written an autobiography, it's being launched in Dublin, and he's visiting England for some days after that and attending a number of functions, and this is a press conference for the British media to quiz him about the situation in Ireland, about the peace process, about what makes him tick, about his life, about his autobiography. And it seems to me that he is a major player in the tragedy of Irish history, and therefore, why not?
This is a commercial activity, though. It's there to promote his book. He's rumoured to be getting £100,000 for it. He's not here to promote the peace mission, is he?
It's not a commercial activity in the sense that anyone's being paid for it. I certainly am not being paid anything for it. The book is actually being launched in Dublin, and he's visiting Britain, and there will be a press conference at the House of Commons. And I think those that don't want to see him in the House of Commons should think for a moment that we do want to get the peace process back on track. Sinn Féin, whatever one thinks of them, are a major player in Irish politics. Adams is a major Irish figure. Surely he has an opinion, and it doesn't have to be agreed with, it could be listened to.
Nonetheless, IRA Sinn Féin has killed many Londoners, most recently at Canary Wharf and so on. Do you not think that you are in fact jumping on the graves of those of the IRA's victims in London by giving this man this privilege?
I think the bombing of Canary Wharf was disgraceful, the loss of life was appalling, and it was a terrible thing to do and a terrible thing that happened there. And I've made that very clear all the way through. Adams is part of a process, and I think that people should listen to what he has to say, agree or disagree with him, but recognise he is part of that process. There's not going to be any peace in Ireland unless one involves the Republican movement in it.
You might think that, but Jerry Adams certainly hasn't said so, has he? He's never condemned any of the IRA's activities, and you are giving him a propaganda coup.
It doesn't mean I agree with everything that is done or said. What I'm not giving is a propaganda coup. What I'm giving is an opportunity for a discussion with him, and those people that disagree with him, why don't they come along and listen to what he has to say, argue with him if they will, but at least get the process going. We need peace in Ireland. Peace in Ireland involves all parties.
Jeremy Corbyn, thank you very much indeed.
Because you were very famous for being, advocating talks with Sinn Féin at a time when it was deeply unpopular. Are you someone who's happy to be, if you like, let's say in the wilderness, against the entire mainstream?
I love being a Member of Parliament, and I love the opportunities to raise things, sometimes difficult issues. And I always felt, from the time I was elected onwards, the only way you were ever going to make progress in Northern Ireland was if you spoke to Sinn Féin and actually had serious negotiations. I maintained a relationship with Sinn Féin all through the 1980s, during the broadcasting ban, the travel ban, and everything else, and I got utterly pilloried by just about everybody for it, except the people of Islington North.
Right.
The Guildford Four were exonerated, along with the Birmingham Six, and there was a peace agreement in Ireland. So he was right, wasn't he?
An overall majority of 100.
The problem for Corbyn was, in the late 1980s, the country and the Labour Party thought he was wrong.
And it's going to be a record-breaking night. 3 victories running for a Prime Minister.
Thank you, David. I've got Ken Livingstone and Jeremy Corbyn here with me.
Defend the health service, defend housing, defend education. London is full of homeless people. What are we going to do for them? No more detentions of any of these asylum seekers. They're not criminals, they're people that are fleeing from crime. Founded as a party dedicated to the provision of universal benefits, universal housing and universal education. I believe the case for public ownership is absolutely overwhelming. I think it's wrong for the party to set as a benchmark competition and market forces as being something to look up to. The need to raise taxation for the above average income people in order to pay for the needs of the rest, and I see a moral justification for that. I think it's the right thing to do. Obviously condemning the bombing campaigns in Britain, it is important to be able to talk to Sinn Féin as a way of demonstrating to Sinn Féin and its supporters that there is some point in dialogue. I think there's definitely a plan to try to diminish or exclude the left within the party. That isn't going to work because the left and the party often represent an awful lot of what popular opinion is about. I'm horrified that there should be any idea of cutting disability and sick benefits. They're not sufficient as it is. Many people live in great poverty because of the inadequate levels of benefits. With something, you should say it. If you don't believe it, you shouldn't say it. I think there are principles involved here. If I stand for election as a Labour candidate, as a socialist, people know what they're voting for.
So you're in favour of the strike?
I'm in favour of a settlement, and I support the strike because they have no alternative but to go on strike at this stage. Tommy, I think they're totally justified in taking strike action. London Underground have broken the agreement they made a year ago. The tube workers balloted and voted for strike action, and that's what is now happening. And we should recognise that they themselves are undergoing hardship because they're losing pay while they're on strike. People don't willingly go on strike. They've done it because they believe they have a just cause, and I support that cause. I think he is under some pressure in that he is told by some people that strikes are very unpopular and unions are very unpopular, therefore if you condemn them your own popularity will rise. What we should remember is that millions of people have voluntarily joined trade unions because they see them as the best way of defending their own living standards and trying to improve their working conditions. And I think we should be supportive of trade unions and supportive of the right of trade unions to take industrial action. If we take away the right to industrial action, then we move ourselves into a totalitarian society of the sort that we would criticise anywhere else in the world, where people are denied the right to take industrial action. Good man, Tommy. We go on the train tomorrow when the strike's over. It's been watered, but it's a lovely smell. Try it again.
We've tried to make capitalism work with good and humane Labour governments, and we haven't succeeded because it can't work, because it rests on injustice, lives on inequalities, and if you try to modify them, then they turn on you and cut back your gains and throw you back to where you started.
The argument always was if you move to the centre, you'll win, but if two centre parties competing for public support, neither of them can be real about changing things. Mrs. Thatcher did change things. She launched into a violent counterattack against democracy and the Labour movement. She did radicalise and create a new situation which New Labour inherited in 1997. But then New Labour was really based on the idea you accepted what Thatcher had done and just bumped along. And when Blair became leader, he said in 1994, New Labour is a new political party, which really was a Thatcherite party.
New Labour, New Britain.
I think the conclusion that lay at the heart of the foundation of New Labour was the idea you couldn't win if you didn't adopt Mrs. Thatcher's policies. And when Mrs. Thatcher was asked her greatest achievement, she said New Labour. The Labour Party was set up as a socialist party, and then when Blair became leader, he abandoned Clause 4 of our Constitution. Clause 4 did make us into a socialist party. It contained within it a basic socialist idea. The purpose of the Labour Party is to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry on the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, and the best obtainable means of popular administration of each industry and service. It was a comprehensive statement. It was no longer the policy of the Labour Party, so Blair decided to get rid of it. And by doing that, he stripped us of our technical claim to be a socialist party.
A dramatic and unexpected climax to the speech, signalling the scrapping of the historic Clause 4, which calls for common ownership, the most dramatic indication of what Mr. Blair means by the New Labour.
Blair, from the very beginning, was reassuring his critics, including Murdoch. Don't worry, when we get there, we won't be a socialist party, we'll be a centre party, and we'll do it better than Thatcher. So in the end, the election was won, I won't say on a fraud, but won on a misunderstanding of what we were really about.
In 1996, Tony Blair joked about the very idea of a Corbyn leadership, saying, "You really don't have to worry about Jeremy Corbyn suddenly taking over." And in the resulting battle for the party's soul, New Labour's triumph seemed total. The message to the left, clear.
We have been elected as New Labour and we will govern as New Labour.
In 1997, a fresh-faced Tony Blair embodied the hopes of a nation as his landslide victory ended 18 years of Conservative rule. But most deadly of all was Blair's dance with one of Labour's worst enemies and one of the world's most powerful men.
Do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes.
Rupert Murdoch's news empire spanned over 150 newspapers across 4 continents, including a third of Britain's newspaper market. His papers had always backed the Tories, and the Tories had always won. But with Labour on course for victory in '97, Murdoch was worried about the party's plans to loosen his grip on the press. But he wouldn't worry for long. In his conference speech, Blair said he opposed new laws to limit how much of the media could be owned by one person. In other words, he opposed his own policy.
He went to make a very clear deal. I will look after your interests if you call off your dogs and if you back me.
Sure enough, by election time in 1997, all of Murdoch's papers backed Blair to the hilt. Once in power, Blair returned the favour, protecting the Murdoch empire from any new media legislation.
New Labour was backed in power by the most powerful media interests, the most powerful corporations and city interests, because they realised he was representing them.
You sup with the devil, you take a long spoon, is the rule, isn't it? And I don't think there's any doubt that as far as British polity is concerned, Rupert Murdoch was the devil in that. To come to an accommodation with him meant sacrificing all the principles the Labour Party stood for.
How would you describe your relationship with Tony Blair?
I'm a supporter.
His government had announced plans to ban tobacco advertising from sport. But what we didn't know was that before coming to power, he had accepted a £1 million donation from Bernie Ecclestone, owner of Formula One. Ecclestone then secretly visited Blair in Downing Street as the decision was being made.
Do you give a donation expecting something in return?
No, I didn't want anything. I still don't want anything, to be honest with you.
Within hours of the meeting, Blair had ordered his minions to grant Formula One a special exemption from the ban.
He was caught red-handed trading policy in return for hard cash from a businessman.
A year into government, Blair yet again overruled his cabinet to rubber stamp BAE's sale of Hawk jets to Indonesia's dictatorship, which was ethnically cleansing thousands in East Timor. When it came to hawking weapons around the world, Blair took his cue from Mrs. Thatcher.
Aircraft are very expensive these days, and so you don't want them to have just one role when that one role is advanced training. So they're also being adapted for strike capacity.
Despite the stench of corruption under New Labour, it would be unfair to dismiss its record entirely. There were some achievements. A national minimum wage was introduced for the first time. Child poverty in the UK was cut significantly. And Blair's finest hour was brokering peace in the north of Ireland, ending decades of conflict. Education and healthcare did receive much-needed investment, but there was a catch. Under New Labour's private finance initiative, corporations were invited to build and run schools and hospitals for the first time. According to the Financial Times, these projects cost taxpayers up to £25 billion more than if they'd been government funded. PFI schools and hospitals slipped into an endless spiral of debt. But debts for some mean profits for others.
Under New Labour, big business bloomed in the City of London because of the effective absence of regulation. Foreign banks were falling over themselves to get business into London because it wouldn't be as tightly regulated as it would elsewhere. The government effectively decided that for the wealthiest and for the biggest business, the tax regime would be almost voluntary.
In a speech at a Goldman Sachs soiree, Blair even boasted how every high roller in the room was paying less tax under him than they had under Margaret Thatcher. When Mrs. Thatcher was asked to name her greatest legacy, her response was immediate. Tony Blair and New Labour.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
And I give you, on behalf of our country, our solidarity, our sympathy, and our support.
They bombarded, occupied, ultimately destroyed one of the world's poorest countries. In truth, Bin Laden was a sideshow. Afghanistan, a springboard for a much more ambitious plan for the region.
I went through the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11. An officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, "Sir, we're going to attack Iraq." I said, "Well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, "No." He said, "We're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years."
We both recognize the danger of Saddam Hussein harboring and developing weapons of mass destruction.
The President is right to draw attention to the threat of weapons of mass destruction. That threat is real.
As minutes of a Bush-Blair meeting spell out, the war was to be justified by imaginary threats, Iraqi terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. But Blair knew his toughest sell would be at home.
The Iraqi regime has weapons of mass destruction, we know that. Weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons.
I don't think anybody in the British Foreign Office believed Saddam had weapons of mass destruction.
WMD now etched onto the public imagination, Blair and his spin doctor Alastair Campbell cobbled together a dossier of so-called intelligence to crank up the fear of Saddam.
He has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes.
Tony Blair was implying that Iraq could launch an attack using weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes against the British Isles. I've been to pretty much all chemical facilities in Iraq. I oversaw the inspections of a huge number. I just don't think there was any evidence to support that they could launch anything within 45 minutes.
The UN inspectors were there and they were finding nothing. So why lie about it, continue to lie, if you had not ulterior motives to go into war regardless?
As the rhetoric heated up, the media coverage heated up, and the poll results followed along, people really became frightened.
He is a man who would likely team up with Al-Qaeda.
Well, that proved a lie. Saddam and Al-Qaeda were enemies.
Ordinary people all over this country can show their disgust at the military policies being pursued by George Bush and very unfortunately supported actively by the British government.
Both Bush as well as Tony Blair are now wanting to plunge the world into a Holocaust. And I'm happy that the people of the world are standing up and opposing.
I say to Mr. Blair, the British people have voted with their feet, and their vote is no war on Iraq.
Thank you to every single person that's here today in the biggest ever political demonstration in the history of this country. And today there are 600 and more demonstrations in cities all around the world. Every country, every continent, everybody in the world has a chance today to say no, absolutely no to war on Iraq. Well, surely the message today in London, in Glasgow, and ordinary people on the streets of this country is this: why are we spending £3.5 billion on a war that nobody wants, when there is an AIDS pandemic sweeping Africa, when a quarter of the world's children die in poverty and starvation, and we say there isn't money sufficient for our own public services? Thousands more deaths in Iraq will not make things right. It will set off a spiral of conflict, of hate, of misery, of desperation that will fuel the wars, the conflict, the terrorism, the depression and the misery of future generations. Our message today here in London, 1 million and more strong, is this: we want to live in a world free from war. The way to free us from the scourge of war is to free ourselves from the scourge of injustice, of poverty and the misery that's associated with that. This movement is giving that message to the British government. Stop now or pay a political price. Thank you very much.
Every member of Parliament tonight who votes for the government motion will be consciously and deliberately accepting the responsibility for the deaths of innocent people if the war begins, as I fear it will. Now, that's for their decision to take. But this is a quite unique debate in my parliamentary experience, where we're asked to share responsibility for a decision we won't really be taking, with consequences for people who have no part to play in the brutality of the regime which we are dealing with.
The cries of millions were ignored.
Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea to remove Saddam Hussein from power.
I would term it to be state terrorism of the first order, in fact. Terrified the Iraqi population of Baghdad.
They refused to count the dead. That is, to their shame, to the end of time.
Thank you, friends. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. It's fantastic to be in this wonderful city in the place where people marched for civil rights and where people marched and marched and marched and stopped the Vietnam War all those years ago. And I bring you the warmest possible greetings from the Stop the War Coalition in Britain and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Last month in London, we organised the biggest ever peace demonstration in British history when 400,000 people marched through the streets of London on September the 28th. To demonstrate our opposition to the war. And on February the 15th, we shall be marching again in a whole weekend of protests in London and every other European capital. And I have to say, as a member of the British Parliament from the Labour Party, that there is overwhelming public opposition to British involvement in a Bush's war over Iraq. Because we recognise this war for what it is. It's not about peace. It's not about democracy. It's not about justice. It's a war about oil, and it's a war where the main beneficiaries will be the arms manufacturers who've made so much out of so much misery for so long. We are in one of the richest countries in the world, and I also represent another very rich country in the world. If all we can say to the poorest people in the poorest parts of the world, suffering water shortage, health shortage, a pandemic of AIDS, and so many other injustices, all we can offer is weapons of mass destruction and further wars. All we do is spawn the conflicts of the future. A world at peace can only be achieved if we're a world based on social justice. So our message to the Capitol, to the White House, to Downing Street in London and all the others is, pull back, bring the troops home, bring about peace in the region, no more wars for oil. Thank you very much.
With Baghdad crushed in a matter of weeks, Bush and Blair boasted of their success.
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed, and Iraq is free.
The triumphalism was amplified by a faithful media.
He said that they would be able to take Baghdad without a bloodbath. He has been proved conclusively right, and it would be entirely ungracious, even for his critics, not to acknowledge that tonight he stands as a larger man and a stronger Prime Minister as a result.
It is not in conformity with the UN Charter from our point of view, and from the Charter point of view, it was illegal.
The Iraqi people bitterly resisted their invaders. Then, in the cruelest of ironies, the invaders unleashed on Iraq the very thing they supposedly invaded the country to prevent: chemical warfare.
Depleted uranium, contaminated sometimes with plutonium, also being used. Now that comes well within the definition of a war crime.
And the rates of cancer have risen enormously. War brutalizes people. And unfortunately, some British soldiers also practice brutality. I think 1 million and more were killed. They want to lower the figures so that history doesn't judge them, because they keep saying Saddam would have killed more had he stayed in power. Well, all the people he killed do not come to that sort of horrific total. Nowhere near it.
I am no supporter of dictators of any sort around the world, but the people of Iraq today have a worse life than they had under Saddam Hussein. It is plainly not as good today as it was before.
Going to war illegally should have brought down the British government, I would have thought, and certainly terminated Mr. Blair's career.
If Tony Blair isn't a war criminal, who is? There can be no such thing as a war criminal if Tony Blair is not one, having started an illegal war of aggression.
Having ignited a fire in the Middle East that might never go out, Blair stepped down as Prime Minister.
JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq war. He was then paid $6 million every year and still is from JP Morgan 6 months after he left office. The man is a war criminal! War criminal! Tony Blair! War criminal!
You gonna read it?
No, I'm going to burn it. I'm not reading this. This is a book written in blood. I was actually just hoping to make a citizen's arrest on Tony Blair.
Quite nice and quiet in here, I would have thought. Aren't you worried that we're going to leap forward and perform some sort of citizen's arrest on you?
No, I'm sort of...
You're safe. It might happen. It could happen.
Never know.
Jeremy Corbyn, Member of Parliament. I'm here today as part of the Palestine Solidarity and Stop the War demonstration, calling for an end to the siege of Gaza and allowing the Viva Palestina convoy to get in. The people of Gaza lost 1,400 people a year ago. We will not forget this. We will keep on with this campaign until the siege is ended and the people of Gaza can live in peace and in freedom.
Full of people from all walks of life in this country expressing their solidarity with the Palestinian people is a very, very important message to get all over the world, because it's a different message than that is being given by our government at the present time. We are speaking for ordinary people when we condemn absolutely and completely the Israeli bombardment of Gaza that is going on at the present time. The people of Gaza, 1.5 million of them, imprisoned by security fences, aircraft on surveillance patrols overhead, warships on the sea along the coast. For them, there is no escape. And the cynical hypocrisy of Foreign Minister of Israel Livni saying we telephone people and text them before we destroy their homes in order to save lives. What cynical hypocrisy is that? The people of Gaza have nowhere to run. They have suffered imprisonment. They have suffered poverty. They've suffered unemployment. They've suffered the shortages of food, of medicines, of energy, of all the things that they need to sustain life. It's not enough for the Western powers to simply express regrets and talk in honeyed terms about disproportionate action. We need action to condemn absolutely the act of war by Israel against the Palestinian people. And we also need to say to Israel, you cannot call yourself a democracy when you imprison the elected leaders of the Palestinian people. And when you signed that special trade agreement between Israel and the European Union, that had within it a human rights clause. You have broken that human rights clause. End the trade with Israel. Stop the arms supplies. Break with the war on terror. End this mad foreign policy that imprisons and kills the people of Palestine. Full support for the Palestinian people.
Pro-Palestinian activists demanded Livni's arrest after Operation Cast Lead the Israel-Hamas war in 2008-2009, accusing her of killing innocent Palestinians, forcing her to cancel a trip to London in 2009 when a British judge issued an arrest warrant for her.
No justice!
An incident prompting the British government to change the law to protect Israeli politicians from arrest based on complaints from pro-Palestinian activists. And Corbyn campaigned against the measures. Writing to Britain's Foreign Secretary in 2013 after another trip to Gaza, conveying a request to stop allowing Israel's criminal politicians to come to our country freely, a goal he said if he hadn't been working towards, he'd have hung his head in shame.
Quite simple. Why do we have a military relationship with a country that abuses human rights, that is under investigation for war crimes, that has killed 2,000 people in the past month in Gaza, not to mention all the others that have been killed in Operation Cast Lead on all the other occasions? Stop all arms trade with Israel now! And time is high for a full-time, long-term peace settlement. That requires recognition. This week there's been a sea change. This week Israel was forced to negotiate with Hamas. This week there is unity of the Palestinian people. No! The West! Cut the trade with Israel. Suspend the EU-Israel trade agreement. Cut the arms sales. Support the people of Palestine. It's now down to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Just like after Harold Wilson, Corbynism was born out of disillusionment with the Labour government. After the party's second defeat in 2015, changes to the party's rules for electing its leader, intended to revive the party's right, instead boosted the left.
I thought he had no chance of winning in May 15, but convinced myself and others that if he fought a good populist campaign, he could get a decent share of the vote and use it to start building what he's always wanted, which is an extra parliamentary mass movement of progressive people.
The deadline for nominations in the Labour leadership contest is midday. The final contender, Jeremy Corbyn, hasn't yet got enough support.
He needs about a nomination every 5 minutes. It's going to be very, very tight.
It got to 10 seconds before the close of nominations, and 2 of them cracked.
I had really mixed feelings when Jeremy got on the ballot paper, because originally I didn't think it was a good idea to have a left candidate on the ballot paper, which sounds a bit odd for someone of my beliefs, I guess. My fear is he'd come last, and that would be used to say, you see, the left's dead, doesn't have any support in the party, game over. Then I thought, if he comes third, that'd be an amazing triumph. But this thing just exploded.
The meetings that we had in Scotland were full of people saying, if this is the Labour Party of the future, I'll be back. They want to come back to us. They have to have a reason to come back to us.
Can we be proud of wanting to live in a civilised society where everybody cares for everybody else? Surely that is something worth aspiring to.
You've already had various attacks in the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, a lot of the right-wing press. And what they're going to do is they're going to go through your life, the life of people close to you. They're going to distort and smear you as best they can. Are you prepared for that?
I've had it before.
But nowhere near this scale?
No, indeed, nowhere near this level. But I have had it before over my meetings with Sinn Féin during the 1980s, my involvement in the peace process in the Middle East. I've had an awful lot of abuse. I deal with it like this. It hurts when it hurts my friends, my family, my loved ones. I don't care what they say about me. I'm not interested. I'm not bothered. As far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of people out there who are leading a very tough life. Children growing up in grossly overcrowded homes where they can't achieve their potential, people sleeping on the streets, people begging, students leaving university with massive debts who can't get a job. All those people deserve something better than name-calling of each other by politicians.
A critique sometimes of the left, of people like ourselves, is we focus often on people just at the bottom of societies. What are the sorts of policies that wouldn't just be good for people at the very bottom of society, people people who are homeless, people who are very low-paid work? What of your policies do you think would appeal to working people who are slap bang in the middle?
I think it's morally reprehensible that we have people sleeping on the streets. I think it's morally reprehensible that people are forced to beg. I think it's morally reprehensible that we're a nation of food banks. There are a lot of people who are not poor who also feel that moral revulsion. Secondly, there's the practical side of it. If we get old, as you and I will one day, in a very long time in your case of course, we're all going to get ill. We're all going to need a health service. We're all going to have relatives who are going to need adult social care. We're all going to have relatives who go through a mental health crisis. At the moment, if you have an elderly relative who goes through an adult social care crisis and needs a great deal of support, they're going to end up having to sell their property, mortgage their homes, pay out everything just to keep that person alive. I think we need a society where the National Health Service and public expenditure takes that over. That's a real sense of security. Secondly, students of all walks of life are now leaving university with massive debt. If instead of cutting corporation tax from 20 to 18%, we raised it to 20.5%, 0.5% increase, that'd be enough to pay for student fees for everybody. That's real security for everybody. My suggestion is that the party has to challenge the politics of austerity, the politics of increasing the gap between the richest and the poorest in our society, and be prepared to invest in a growing economy rather than accepting what has been foisted upon us by the banking crisis of 2008-9. We don't have to set this arbitrary date, which in effect means the poorest and most vulnerable in our society pay for the banking crisis rather than those that caused it.
I mean, do you think... Yeah. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that people want a party that they can be proud of again.
Yeah. Gentleman just there in the front row.
The answer is inspiring people. The answer is showing that you've got the power of your convictions and you stand up for yourself and you stand up for what you believe in. And that's exactly, Jeremy's said everything that I would want to say about how you inspire new people to stand up for and take their vote. You know, there's nearly a third of the electorate didn't bother voting last time. And it's because everybody looks the same. And no offence, we're all one party, but honestly, you really do look the same. Jeremy's the only one with the principles.
There is a quote from you in the Sun newspaper today from a video you did where you really questioned the need for an armed forces on the scale that we have it in this country, even after recent cuts. Would you stand by those remarks?
I don't know what the remarks are because I don't buy the Sun newspaper.
So, Jeremy, there are issues that we agree on that we should oppose George Osborne's 40% cuts. But the issue that I've raised concern with you about is your proposal for the Bank of England to print money to pay for schools or transport. In those circumstances, do you believe that the government would have to pay that money back to the Bank of England, or do you think that this is free money?
We put £385 billion worth of money called quantitative easing into the banks to bail them out in 2008. We bought bank shares and put them in a holding company, some of which Osborne is now selling off, and he shouldn't because they're not his to sell, they're ours to keep. And my suggestion is that some of that quantitative easing ought to be made available together with other sources such as government bonds to fund a national investment bank so that we have a growing economy which can improve the infrastructure in all parts of the UK. It's not inflationary. Japan used quantitative easing after 10 years of a flatlining economy in order to boost growth. I would have thought it's a sensible and reasonable precautionary thing to do.
It's not fair, and we will let people down if we do.
I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at the proposals, and they are proposals that have been put forward and have been supported by a very large number of economists, including Nobel Prize-winning economists, who say this is a sensible and reasonable idea that we do a combination of, during a period of recession, to use quantitative easing, during a period of growth, you use government bonds as a way of funding development within our society. The problems we've got, and I repeat it, is that we are funding public services by the sale of assets, by private finance initiative, and we are losing control of those assets, and it's costing a lot of people very dear.
Let's have a strong, real alternative, and we should work together on doing that, but you're not doing so because you're offering people false hope instead.
I'm very pleased that you accept that the politics of austerity is one of the problems we face. We went into the last election promising cuts. We went into the 2010 election promising cuts. Are we going to go into a 2020 election because Osborne will not have balanced the books by that stage, saying, well, an incoming Labour government, the first thing we've got to do is make more cuts in order to make ourselves credible? I say invest to grow.
Yes,
you can't cut your way to prosperity. You grow your way to prosperity. Jeremy Corbyn, do you see this line of continuity between New Labour and welfare cuts under the Tories?
Yeah, there was a narrative in New Labour that was quite aggressive in its implementation of regulations, and that has got considerably worse. And last week, Ian Duncan-Smith was forced to publish the figures of the tragedies, the number of people that have died, whilst being sanctioned on benefits, which is truly frightening.
What this represents really is a pretty wholesale trashing of the New Labour approach, which you were part of.
Look around any city, the people that are sleeping rough, the people that are begging, the people that have been completely forgotten by the system, and they end up, and we've almost institutionalised charities and food banks to make up for the deficiencies of the welfare state. Can't we be proud of having a society in which there is a safety net that does prevent people falling into destitution?
What about fitness to work tests that have put the disabled back to work? Would you get rid of all of that?
I have huge problems with them. I've met so many people with disabilities who've been through fitness for work tests where they've been approved as fit for work. Clearly are not. Some are suffering mental health conditions. Some even commit suicide as a result of it. Most of them, I think, in fact, 60% win appeals on this. So if 60% of decisions are being overturned on appeal, there's something badly wrong. You have to talk to people if you're going to make progress. You have to oppose anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, far-right racism all the time, and we all do all the time. You're not going to bring about a Middle East peace process unless Israel negotiates with both Hamas and Fatah, and everybody knows that. And indeed, Israel is already been in talks with Hamas through the proximity talks in Cairo. Indeed, I hesitate to quote him, but Tony Blair has actually met Hamas far more times than I have. I've spoken to Hamas. Indeed, I met Hamas in the company of a large number of members of Parliament from the British Parliament and parliaments all across Europe in their role as the elected government of Gaza. Does that mean we agree with all the policies elected government of Gaza? Absolutely not. Does it mean one wants to try and bring about a process which will end the siege of Gaza, which will end the ghastly situation that many Palestinian people are living in? Yes. And do many Israeli people agree with what we're saying on that? Absolutely yes. Okay. There are many who do.
In 2015, you said of people voting for Jeremy Corbyn, if their heart says vote for Corbyn, well, get a transplant.
Have you heard what Tony Blair said about you this morning?
Yes.
What did you make of it?
Well, he's entitled to his opinions.
Thanks very much. Well, let's just listen to Mr. Corbyn.
It's perfectly okay, he's entitled to his opinions, but let's have a debate about policies.
This is the 99th event that we've done as part of this campaign. Saturday will be the 100th event. We will know the results. And I'm looking forward to that with interest.
The new Labour leader will be announced this morning. Many in the party now expect it to be Jeremy Corbyn.
Before we head on down, can I just say to all of you, thank you very, very much for a fantastic 100 days campaigning.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
In the less than kind way that Labour run these things, the candidates for leader were told the results before they entered the room. And if there was any lingering doubt about who had won, the faces of Jeremy Corbyn's opponents said it all.
251,000.
Nearly 60% of the vote, nothing other than a landslide, a thumping win by the man who only just scraped onto the ballot.
And I say thank you in advance to us all working together to achieve great victories, not just electorally for Labour, but emotionally for the whole of our society, to show we don't have to be unequal, it doesn't have to be unfair, poverty isn't inevitable, things can and they will change. Thank you very much.
Even bigger than Tony Blair's result when he won the leadership 21 years ago. Marks of victory for everything Tony Blair tried to bury. Jeremy Corbyn, the antithesis of Tony Blair, now leads.
Wow, no political campaign in British political history can claim to have gone from such an outside, supposedly no hope of position to being so unbelievably triumphant. And it wasn't just a win, it was a huge win in every single section, members, supporters, affiliates. Hear that enthusiasm.
I've just been given this on the way in. Hope is the fuel of progress, and fear is the prison in which you put yourself. Tony Benn. we celebrate an amazing triumph and an amazing victory, an amazing inclusive campaign, united together, wanting to achieve something better and something decent, a society based on socialist values. Together, we are very, very strong. Thank you very much.
You did it, Jeremy.
It was possible.
It's beyond my wildest dreams.
Then he was off to his first outside speech as Labour leader.
Welcome, Jeremy Corbyn! When I was declared elected 3.5 hours ago, I announced to our conference that my first action in this new position as leader of the Labour Party would be to come to a demonstration in support of refugees, the right to asylum and the human needs of people all over the world.
Earlier, Jeremy Corbyn had hugged his vanquished rivals, knowing that two of them, Yvette Cooper and Liz Kendall, were leading a walkout from the shadow cabinet. Chakra Amuna and Tristram Hunt, Shadow Health Minister Emma Reynolds on the left, also amongst MPs who said they would leave their front bench jobs. Now Jeremy Corbyn was leader.
Sometimes called the Blairites, who walked away from the shadow cabinet one by one.
I said right from the beginning of this process that I wouldn't seek to serve in the front bench, so I'll be supporting the Labour Party and representing Stoke-on-Trent from the backbenches.
Have you made up your mind?
I'm not staying in the shadow cabinet.
While others said they haven't been approached but didn't expect to be.
Clear result which needs to be respected. Congratulations to Jeremy, but the really important thing now is that we face out to the country.
We know what Labour supporters wanted. What will voters now make of their decision?
He's deeply authentic, and everything he said today he means.
Michael Meacher was a fellow long marcher with Jeremy Corbyn from the 1980s, but the left has been ambushed by its current success. The planning is limited, the team very small. Even after such a convincing vote, many aren't sure Jeremy Corbyn is in this job for long.
I think translating from being against and being a maverick into being a party leader and a potential Prime Minister is going to be the most enormous challenge that any recent politician has ever faced.
And if a group of people feel that Jeremy Corbyn's election is a reason for them to leave the Labour Party, what were they doing in the Labour Party in the first place? This is a party that represents ordinary people, working class and middle class people. It's in favour of the redistribution of wealth, it's in favour of public services. And I do think an awful lot of people who really weren't terribly Labour did sort of scaddle in and slip into nice safe seats with the backing of the machine. And if they want to go, let them go.
Under Corbyn, Labour membership has surged, and the Corbynites believe that a large base will keep the party on the left, preventing the compromises of the Wilson and Blair governments.
He was carried to victory on a wave of popular support from a younger generation who had turned away from traditional politics, looking for a leader who might change things. The outsider had taken control.
Fantastic moment, fantastic mandate for change in Britain, fantastic enthusiasm for real democratic politics. It's a great day.